just got my pass for Sundance today. I don't know if you can see that.
Cool. Hello, welcome to Reel Film Snobs. I'm Angela Yeager. I am joined again today by my special regular guest host, Ernie Quiroz. Welcome to the show, Ernie.
Hey, good to be here as always.
Yes, and Ernie is back. He is right in the buzz, right in the thick of things with film festival season. We happen to catch him like between film festivals. It's like he's flying to Santa Barbara, then he's off to Sundance, and he's the man about town, the man about the world for films. But we're here today to talk about hidden gems of 2022. And these are films that you might have missed. You may not have even heard of these films. These are films that Ernie and I felt like really got overlooked when there was so much else going on, especially in streaming. And so we wanted to bring these to your attention. So all four of the films we're going to talk about today are available on streaming. And these are ones that really stuck with us but didn't get enough attention. So we have a mix of fictional and documentary films for you. So I will kick it off with our first film, which I'm going to butcher the name of. So I'm warning everyone right now. And I'm going to say it's pronounced Lingui, the Sacred Bonds. And that could be totally wrong. It is by the great African filmmaker Mahamat-Saleh Haroun. And it's about a single mother who lives kind of in the outskirts of the capital of Chad, who is working to provide for herself and her 15-year-old daughter. And she discovers that her daughter is pregnant and does not want the child. And they begin to seek out an abortion, which is illegal in Chad by both religion and law. This film, as I mentioned, was directed by Mahamat-Saleh Haroun, who is a filmmaker from Chad, who's made all of his movies there. He's made a lot of really terrific films. I would suggest starting with really any of his films. I think two of his best ones are A Screaming Man from 2011, and then there's an earlier film he did called A Dry Season. He's very interested in family relations and how those kind of the family dynamics interplay with some of the local politics in Chad, and that's a common theme in a lot of his films. One of the really interesting things about this movie, it was one of two movies, actually, it was, gosh, more than two. There were several films that came out in 2022 dealing with abortion rights issues, including a French movie called Happening, which is also really terrific. The documentary The Janes, of course, which got quite a bit of buzz and some attention. This one, unfortunately, just seemed to get almost no attention, and I think it's actually one of the best on that topic because it really deals with the infrastructure that these women have to deal with in a place we think of as remote and maybe third world, and then we see how much it is like our own society. So I'm
Yeah.
curious to hear what you thought, Ernie.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned Happening. And which I just saw maybe about a week ago. And then this movie, Lingui, I saw before the Roe v. Wade decision, and it's interesting. Obviously, all these films were made before that decision was made, and so they take on a whole different dimension. Post
Right.
repeal. But it's interesting that, so Happening is a French film that takes place in the 50s, and this Lingui is more contemporary, but in a different country. So it's interesting that all of these films that depict abortion and sort of like the struggle for abortion were all separated from us by either time or distance.
Hmm.
So it was almost like, oh, that was a different time. That couldn't happen now. Or, oh, that's in Africa. That would never happen here. And now it's happening here,
Right. Yeah, I thought that was really powerful about all the films that came out this year, including The Janes, which is also another one that was filmed before the Roe v. Wade decision happened, but anticipates and but talks about the U.S. pre-Roe v. Wade, right? What it was like for women in these underground abortion movements, and then in Happening, it's France before abortion was legal, and this film, it's now in another country. But it's certainly women living in a rural area where it's very religious, and they're basically told by men that you don't have a choice in this. And it's also a very interesting dynamic because the mother in this movie is also ostracized by the community because she's a single mother, even though it wasn't her fault. She sounds like, based on the story, she was abandoned, but in their culture, that's a big no no. So she's a single mother, and now she's got a daughter who might also be shunned like she was, and she's trying to make a better future for her daughter, which I think a lot of parents could relate with.
Yeah. Yeah, I really do like the relationship between the mother and daughter. This is such a great, uh, we were talking about all the sort of the political aspects of it, but as a film, yeah, I mean, great acting, again, beautiful cinematography, a very well made film, and just the mother-daughter relationship that's depicted in this film is just extraordinary to see that.
It's one of the things in all of his films I've discussed, the performances are just absolutely fantastic. Of course, you've never seen any of these actors before, but you're just watching. I mean, in every single one of his performances, he gives such humanistic, such natural performances out of his actors. And I felt like I was right there with them throughout the entire movie. Gorgeous cinematography as well, but amazing lead performances by both the mother and the daughter. So definitely one
Yeah.
to check out. This one is a little harder to find, but it is on Mubi for those who have that streaming service for free, or you can do it on demand, pay for it on demand for only a few dollars on Amazon or Apple. So highly recommend this one.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll shift gears and maybe go a little bit lighter now for one of my picks is called Dual, spelled D-U-A-L. So, a word that has double meaning, and you'll find out in when I talk about it. This is on Hulu. This came out at Sundance. Now would be a year ago. And then yeah, it's another one that I thought was really sort of a very dry, deadpan, dark comedy that I thought would find an audience, and just it never did. So this is by Riley Stearns, a filmmaker who made Art of Self-Defense. If you're familiar with that film, I really like that film as well. The same sort of humor, the same sort of very dry, deadpan humor. This is sort of a sci-fi-ish film where Karen Gillian, who people will probably most recognize from the Marvel movies, she's in I can't remember the name of her character, but she's in Guardians of the Galaxy films. So she stars as a woman who has a terminal disease, and she decides to have herself cloned so that her clone can sort of ease the burden of her friends and family who don't have to deal with her death. So she clones herself so that the clone can kind of live on with her friends and family. The original version of herself, has a miraculous recovery, and she ends up being cured of her disease. And so now there's two of her. And so they have to duel to see which one of them becomes the real her. They can't have two of her. And the irony is that her friends and family prefer the clone they over the original. So then and I guess this happens enough in this society that it's sort of mandated that she fights herself on like national TV, like a reality TV show type thing. So then it's about her sort of training to fight herself in a duel.
I'm actually surprised too this wasn't a bigger hit. When I was watching it, I thought, gosh, I can imagine a lot of people that like, for instance, I mean, I don't think it's as good a movie as Everything Everywhere All at Once, but I could imagine people who kind of dig like a quirky sense of humor, kind of sci-fi-ish elements in a movie. This one, the humor is a little quirkier in that, like you mentioned, it's very dry. Like the main character, she's so deadpan that at times I'm like, I really wonder why you want a clone, because you don't really seem like you enjoy life all that much. But that's sort of part of the point, right? Her clone her boyfriend and her mother prefer the clone to her eventually, which makes things very difficult for her. But then she goes into training, which that was one of my favorite sequences with Aaron Paul. For people who might, isn't that his name? That actor
Yeah,
who,
yeah.
yeah, Aaron Paul, the actor who was in
Breaking Bad.
Ernie.
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. Yes, thank you. And that's a hilarious sequence because she goes into training for their big duel and he's showing her all these movies and she has to watch movies of like horrific death scenes and stuff to like try to like, tamp down on her emotions and then some training sequences. And his character is also very weirdly dry humored.
Yeah, yeah. So there, I think this movie and After Yang, which was another one of yours, sort of hidden gems, a film that sort of got dumped out there. This and After Yang probably have some of the oddest, most unexpected dance sequences in
Yes.
a film. The
Uh-huh.
kind of like out of left field dance sequence. Karen Gillian, I think, she does a really great job. Comedic actresses don't, comic performances don't get enough uh, attention, and especially
Hmm.
when she's playing two different roles and a deadpan one. I think, this film is very, very funny. She's very funny. I don't think she gets enough credit for being a comedian. Um, but I think you sort of hit the nail on the head. Is that here she is, she's sort of, she's fighting the original version, she's fighting this cancer, this, terminal illness, and then she survives, and then she has to fight for her life again. And
Hmm.
then it's almost like, what is she fighting for? Like, yeah, you want to, we all think like, oh yeah, we want to fight to live, but to live in a shitty apartment and then to, pay off your student loans, and you're like, that's the life you're fighting for,
Right. She doesn't seem like she's got, I mean, she has a boyfriend, but he seems kind of not that great. And her mother irritates her and eventually prefers her clone. So it does sort of beg that question, I think, where what she's fighting for it alone. And in a way, it's just like, well, just to be alive. It does, you don't have to really have any reason, right? To fight to be alive, I suppose, even if your life isn't very exciting, which I kind of liked that aspect of it too. It's not like she has some amazing, glamorous life that she's fighting for. She's just fighting for it to be hers. But even when she goes into the cloning place and they're like, why do you want to do this? And she's like, oh, I don't want my mom to miss me. That's like the only reason she can think of why she's even doing it. So that was the one part I thought was interesting. So what's her motivation for going through this process? Because it's expensive and she doesn't have a lot of money. And so there were
Yeah.
some issues like that I had with kind of the concept of the film. I did like the dance sequence. I like a good random dance sequence, especially when it's well played. So, and you're right. I loved After Yang, which I thought was outstanding as well. But this is a quirky little film, and I'm surprised it didn't find. I guess I shouldn't be. I'm not surprised it didn't find an audience, but I think it's too bad because I think it's one that could have found kind of a cult following and still could.
Yeah, and like I said, the filmmaker's previous film, Art of Self-Defense, you should also watch that. I really like that one too. Also, same brand of humor.
Same type of humor. I'll have
So
to check it out because I liked this one and I haven't seen his previous film. And I thought it was really good. I have to mention that she plays a clone of herself and with very little, they didn't do anything really other than have a different top on to make the clone looks exactly like her, obviously. But I could always tell who was the
yeah,
clone and who wasn't. And I think
yeah,
that's her performance. That's a good performance.
yeah. Like I said, I mean, it's tricky, and it could easily fall into like caricature or whatever. I think she does a really good job of playing legitimately like two different people who happen to look alike, who are clones of each other.
Hmm.
So my next film is a documentary called Riotsville, USA. This is by, is it Sierra Petergill, I believe. So this is a documentary in the form. I really like this sort of recent trend of documentaries that almost use archival footage exclusively. Like there's no real talking heads. There's no sort of interviews or voice of God narrator. It's just sort of using all this existing footage, and through the power of film and cinema tells a story. So this takes place in the 60s, after sort of the race riots of the civil rights movement, of where police needed to, well, they felt they needed to increase their training to deal with literal riots in the streets. And so they were these sort of fake little towns, almost like a movie set, were sort of built where police could train in essentially military style tactics to for riot suppression, to quell uprisings. And they filmed all of these, and these were sort of exercises done, um, and you kind of see the beginning of the militarization of the police, issues that we're now dealing with 40 plus years later, of where these are really no longer a police force. They're essentially an occupying force. They're a military force.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that here. There were a couple things, that I did not know, that I'm ashamed to say that I didn't know. So this was all sort of done in the wake of these, like I said, in the civil rights movement in the 60s. There was a report that was commissioned by Lyndon Johnson called the Kerner Report. I didn't know anything about this, and they talk about this in the film. But they essentially, Lyndon Johnson, they did the study where they, well, what are the causes of these riots? Like, why are people rioting? And the Kerner Report basically laid it all out, and it was right there, like, oh, gee, lack of economic opportunity. It's the idea of, like, home ownership or education, like all these different things of, like, that's why they're rioting. And the answers are right there. And it was sort of like, well, what do we do about that? Could we change society? What can we do? And that was one idea. The other idea was like, well, let's just ignore that and let's just, build up a military
Focus on the
force.
police. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I cannot tell you how thankful I am that you recommended this movie, because Ernie, because this would have totally gone under my radar. I think this is a terrific documentary. I think every American should be required to watch it. I especially with how all of this radiates through our current culture. I did not know about this report that Johnson commissioned to deal with. It was about what's going on in America. Why are these riots happening? Johnson was convinced it was that they were going to find that there were shady characters, basically, bad actors that were, going into these different communities and causing riots and disturbances. And this commission, which was a nonpartisan, bipartisan, it was included Republicans. He actually only selected moderates from their parties. Back then, in those days, there used to be moderates in both parties. He selected only moderates from both Republicans and the Democrats to be on this commission. He gave them a year to come up with this report, and they did it. It was this. They printed it. They sold it on the streets for $1, the report, and it outlined everything we needed to know to help with race issues in America. And it was around, economic security and poverty and education and school programs and all these things that needed invested in. And there was this tiny section in the back that said, oh, also you could do this with the police and militarize them. And once it all got out, they said, we're not going to do any of this other stuff, but we will do this part. And so it's incredible that they ignored everything else that was in the report because they were worried it was too expensive because of Vietnam. And they only grasped onto this idea of getting tanks and military arsenal against communities. And then they set up, the reason it's called Riotsville, USA, is they set up these mock communities that look like actual buildings. And then hired people to play actors to stage riots where they could then have the police and these military tanks and things come out and then, and live act out an actual riot scenario. And they spent all their money on that instead of all the things that actually would have made a difference. It was pretty eye-opening.
Yeah. And I see so many films, so many documentaries that sometimes I do feel like I do get like cynical or jaded, and but this when I saw this movie, I can't remember the last time I was so angry. I was so angry because it's like we had the answer. We knew it. We knew it.
They have the blueprint. It's still there. That's the thing. This document's probably available. And they did the committee actually did a good job for a government committee. They really outlined all the issues. They even put a dollar figure to how much it would take to fix it. We need to build in our communities. We need infrastructure in the Black community.
60 years ago, we figured it all out. And it's like, and we did nothing.
And still Detroit is in crumbles, and still Chicago, all the cities that they talked about in the 60s that had issues, it's still the same. So that part of it was frustrating, but the movie is really essential viewing. And I also think, I agree with you. At first I wasn't sure how I liked the style, because it was kind of taking me aback, like, oh, there's no talking heads or anyone who's going to explain what's going on. But you're right. The Fire of Love was another documentary that had this style where it was just showing archival footage, and then there's a narrator, but that's it, right? To kind of clue us
there's
into
some text.
going on.
There's some sort of expository text every now and again to kind of help with some of the heavy part. But for the most part, it's just through the the power of editing or cinema itself that sort of tells the story. I do have to mention. So the filmmaker made another very similarly constructed film called The Reagan Show, obviously about
Mm.
Ronald Reagan, where again he just uses like archival footage of some of Reagan's speeches and things like that to sort of paint this portrait of Ronald Reagan. So if you're into sort of that sort of archival type, almost like a found footage type thing, but in documentary, check that out.
Definitely glad that you picked this one out. It's available on Hulu and on demand as well if you don't have Hulu. So definitely check this one out. Another one that didn't, I feel like, get much attention. I did think it showed at Sundance, but so many great documentaries out there this year. I think this was a particularly, when I say this year, I mean last year, 2022, I think was a very good year for documentaries. So we'll move on, speaking of which, to my next super cheery one, which is called Navalny, which is about the Russian activist Navalny, who Alexei Navalny. He was the Russian opposition to Putin, and the film follows him as he's on the campaign trail to try to run against Putin. This is a few years ago. And then the film gets really weird because they just happen to be there while all this stuff happens to him, including him getting poisoned and almost dying, and then getting shipped out of the country to protect his life. And this was one of these films where you're just watching it and going, holy cripers, how is this happening in front of, they talk about, I mean, from the filmmaking perspective, very lucky that they were documenting him and doing a movie about how he's this rising superstar in Russian politics. And then at that moment, all these things happen where he's poisoned and he almost dies, and then he's shuttled off to Europe, and then he makes the decision to go back to Russia. And I'm not giving anything away here because if you're following the news, he's in prison and has been, and is fighting to get out of prison. So it's again another really, I think, really necessary viewing for what's going on in Russia right now, but of course, which also impacts the U.S. And to see what kind of links are being done over there to keep the leader in power. And then we see, one of the things I liked about this movie, and I'm curious to hear what you thought, Ernie, but is that Navalny is not, in some ways he's being propped up as kind of like this answer to Putin or as this Russian savior of some sorts. But the film is pretty balanced, and it shows that he's got some issues too. He's not a perfect candidate, but he is opposition to Putin, which, they need. But he's got issues. He had some support from some white supremacist groups at one time, and he has to answer to that. And so there's, he's a politician, so he's got issues, right? But the question is, did those issues make him, does that make him deserve to have to be poisoned and then imprisoned for the rest of his life?
Yeah, yeah. This was just utterly riveting. I mean, this was shocking. Like you said, when it takes this turn, and this is just a really, a thriller on the level of any other sort of political espionage thriller of a scripted film.
Oh yeah, more
Yeah,
exciting than a James Bond movie, and shorter, I might add.
yeah. Exactly. But yeah, yeah, all the political intrigue and sort of spy versus spy type things. And then, as you said, even though this film was, I mean, it was released over a year ago, and the bulk of it takes place even before that, still relevant today. Still relevant. There's still, this is, you watch the film and you could make another film of just what's happened since that film, with
Oh yeah,
Navalny.
because the movie kind of ends with him going to prison, and he is now, there's a campaign to try to. I Googled him, and he's trying to, he's struggling in prison. He's still trying to get out. Um, People are trying to get him out, but he had these weird corruption charges kind of pinned on him that seemed like they were kind of drummed up out of somewhere. But he's been in prison, I think, for 2 years now, and so, but he just made the news again in the last 24 hours. He's been in the news again, so it's very relevant.
Yeah. And then the one good thing, as a film, and I think this is probably going to get an Oscar nomination. I think it seems to be getting a lot of buzz as such. So hopefully, again, people will get a chance to see it. I think it's on. Did you already say it's? Is it on Apple Plus, or how did?
This one, I believe, is on HBO.
It's on yes, HBO.
Yes. So definitely check out this film if you have access to HBO, or maybe some other. I'm trying to see if it's on any other streaming services. It's definitely on HBO Max. It looks like that's mainly the place you can find it. So it's HBO Max, but definitely worth watching it. Boy, it was exciting. I have to say, I was on, like you said, it's almost like a thriller. I just kept thinking, what's going to happen next? And then it got even crazier. I mean, every time you thought, oh, that can't be, like those guys that look really creepy, like they could be KGB. Oh, it turns out they actually are, something like
Yeah.
that. I mean, it's just, it's wild, the
And
stuff
there are
going
so
on in
many
these movies.
documentaries, like you said, obviously they had no when the filmmakers were making this movie, they had no idea that this is the movie that they were going to make. They
Yeah.
were sort of, I think they were just sort of following him around as a political opposition leader, and just sort of like, oh, let's make this movie about him, and then like it takes this turn of this, this attempt on his life and all this stuff, and sometimes those documentaries are the best, of where the filmmakers themselves don't know what film they're making.
Exactly. Yeah, they don't know where it's going. So, yeah, so some great films again today, Ernie. I would say, gosh, I don't know if I could just pick one of these. These are all really great. Duel is probably the one I gave the lowest rating to because I had some issues with some like the story elements, but I still think it's definitely the lightest film out of this batch. And, really these are all great picks. I hope that people are able to check some of these movies out because people always say there's nothing good showing, and there's actually, I feel like we have more good options than ever. It's just you have to seek them out and have to be
Yeah.
willing to take, a little bit of depressing movies. It's true.
Yeah, I would say, if I had to pick just one, for me, Riotsville, I think it's so important on so many levels, it's eye-opening, of what's been going on in this country for the last 60 years. And I think
Yeah.
people need to hear that, people need to know that. And a lot of it, there's some tough things in it, but and it's going to make you angry, like it made me angry. But hopefully out of that anger, then we can have
I
change.
think it should be required to be taught. It will never happen, but I think it'd be great if it was required to be taught in civics classes because to me, it's just a
Well, that's your
fundamental part of
liberal.
democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Won't happen, especially at Arizona where you are, but no, I'm just kidding.
It's never, yeah, they critical race theory and all this crazy. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're
exactly. Exactly. But very, very great. Some great picks. So hope you all were taking notes at home because we've got a lot of great picks for you. And in February, Ernie will be back because we'll be talking about some of our favorite movies of 2022. So you don't want to miss that episode. But thank you again, Ernie, for being on the show. As I appreciate you and can't wait to hear from all your film festival adventures, all the great movies that I should be watching in the next year because I'll get a leg up now because I'll get the the heads up from Ernie on what's the good stuff out there. So glad to have you on as always. Our website is realfilmsnobs.com. Make sure to go to YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you get notified when there's new episodes. We're on CC Media, Scan TV in Silverton, Corvallis Access Media, KMUZ Radio, KMWV, and of course we have a podcast as well. I'd like to thank our fabulous crew, which is mainly these days Mr. Brad Wortman, who I could not do this show without. Thank you to Brad and our fabulous sponsors. And of course, my delightful and wonderful guest host, Ernie Quiroz. Thank you very much. Have a great day and great movies.